Good evening, I'm political editor Dennis Welch, and this is Politics Unplugged. Well, some call it a power grab, while others say it's about exposing dark money donors. Regardless, it's a fight that puts the Secretary of State in one side of the ring and the Citizens Clean Elections Commission in the other. And joining us tonight to discuss both sides of the issues is the State Elections Director, Eric Spencer, and Tom Collins, the Executive Director of the Arizona Citizens Clean Election Commission. And Mr. Collins, let's start with you. Why are you fighting to expose this dark money donor group? The Supreme Court has already ruled on this.
Well, Dennis, you know, the Supreme Court in Citizens United, which I think many of your viewers are probably familiar with, said that corporations are able to spend money out of their general treasury to influence elections, and that's fine, and I think that everybody accepts that that's the law. But the Citizens United decision made clear that disclosure of information about elections, whether it be the expenditures or the donors, is an important part of informing voters about who's vying for their vote. It's part of the marketplace of democracy. That's something that the voters put in place through the Citizens Clean Elections Act. They put in place a mechanism to try to make sure that we're getting the kind of disclosure that we need, and so the Commission is doing its voter-mandated duties.
And Mr. Spencer, let's get with you. Why would you support something like this? I mean, dark money donors, I mean, who wants to support dark money, right?
Well, Dennis, the issue is not how we regulate dark money, but who gets to regulate it. And the Secretary of State is the officer in charge of elections in Arizona, according to the Constitution. On the other hand, the Clean Elections Commission has a completely separate, much more narrow mission. It's not empowered to even get into this area whatsoever. So Secretary of State Reagan's principal objection was that the Commission has no business regulating on her turf.
Yeah, and sticking with Secretary of State Michelle Reagan, recently she said that she hopes the Citizens Clean Election Commission will refocus on the mission given to it by the voters and withdraw this dangerous and ill-conceived proposal. What is dangerous and what is ill-conceived about this idea?
Well, it's dangerous and ill-conceived in two ways. Number one, the content of the particular rule that the Commission is proposing is blatantly unconstitutional. But even if they amended it slightly and made it somewhat less unconstitutional, they don't have any authority to be in this space in any way, shape, or form. Their mission is solely to regulate participating candidates who take taxpayer-funded money to run their campaigns, some voter education efforts, but they don't have the authority to get into the business of regulating when someone becomes a PAC or not.
And Mr. Spencer, just bring it home really to our viewers. Why should they care about this? I mean, why is this good for them? Why is this good for democracy?
Well, they should care because anytime a government agency is engaging in a brazen power grab, it should trouble them, and especially in this type of space. This is the First Amendment. This is an area where citizens need free rein to voice their political opinions without the fear of having to look over their shoulder of government. And now for a second agency to come in that doesn't even have authority in the first place to second-guess the regulatory decisions of the Secretary of State, that puts a chilling effect on First Amendment free speech, and anybody who cares about government overreach should really care about this particular form of government overreach.
And Mr. Collins, jump in on this. Now, he's accusing you of a dangerous power grab here.
Yes, well, you know, with all due respect to Eric, nothing he said is factually true. The Clean Elections Act was enacted by the voters, and the voters gave the Clean Elections Commission the authority to work to secure that we would have an elections free from corruption and a politics that people can participate in. And so that's what the Commission is doing. It's performing its voter mandated. In fact, you know, the courts have agreed with this. To just quote chapter and verse from the Arizona Supreme Court, the Commission has the authority to regulate independent expenditures. That's the thing we're talking about when we're talking about dark money. That doesn't relate to any of its other duties. In fact, the Supreme Court said that if all of our other duties went away, that duty would remain. So that's a paramount duty in the words of the courts, and the voters gave that duty to the Commission because they knew that you can't trust politicians to regulate politics all the time. You want to have an independent voice that can secure the process against the influence of donors on politicians. Politicians have a totally different viewpoint on how they go about their jobs, and rightly so, of course, because there's a political process. So having an agency that's not responsive to donors, but can be responsive to the law and the mandate that the voters gave it to address issues like independent expenditures is really important. That's what the voters wanted. That's what they got in the Clean Elections Commission. That's what the Commission's doing.
And Mr. Collins, I gave Mr. Spencer a chance to answer this question. I'll ask it to you. Bring it home to our viewers. Why should they care? How is this this going to impact their lives, this dark money, these so-called dark money donations?
Well, the issue with dark money is that what we have is a campaign system that I think everybody agrees has gone from one that used to be a little bit creaky to one that's really got problems. I mean, we had in the 2014 election the most expensive, least transparent election in state history. I think everyone agrees that that was something that we should be working on, and we're actually looking forward and hoping that the Secretary of State will weigh in a constructive way in the open rulemaking process we have. Everybody, in fact, is invited to comment to the Commission at the Commission's website, azcleanelections.gov. But the reason why this matters is because, as Justice Kennedy pointed out in Citizens United, when you don't know who's contributing to the elections, and you don't know who's making the expenditures, then you don't know who's really vying in the marketplace of ideas. And that comes home on policy, for example, at the legislature. If you know that such and such an interest has been the advocate for a candidate over the course of years, and that candidate uses a specific tax break for that group, that's information voters are entitled to know. That's the kind of thing that Justice Kennedy said is specifically part of First Amendment interest. The government has an interest in providing for the public, and the public has an interest in receiving, under the First Amendment, information so they understand how decisions are being made in government. You can't get a politics free from corruption unless you have information.
All right. Now, I want to get you a chance to get in on this, Mr. Spencer Carey, to respond to some of those comments Mr. Collins made. He did say that, with all due respect, that you gave a lot of information that wasn't factual.
Well, I respectfully disagree with my friend Tom. I think he's mistaken his commission's role for the Republic of California. You know, in that state, their Secretary of State is divided in responsibility from the Political Fair Practices Commission. They've got a dual setup there where this commission is set up to regulate candidates and dispense opinions. That's not what the Clean Elections Commission was set up to do. It was passed way back in 1998, 12 years before the Citizens United decision came down by the Supreme Court. There was no such thing as dark money. The only thing the voters were interested in when they passed Prop 200 in 1998 was curbing direct contributions to candidates. But the independent expenditure problem that Mr. Collins and his commission are attempting to regulate now was not at issue in that initiative in any way, shape, or form. Dark money was not even a term that existed in popular lexicon. So for the commission to think that it has authority over this is really disingenuous. Their authority is much more circumscribed.
Dennis, that is simply false. The voters were voting for a clean election system. The Clean Elections Act defines independent expenditures in terms that include all kinds of matters, including corporations, LLCs, and unions. And in fact, the Commission had a rule long before Citizens United that required anyone, including corporations and LLCs, who may have been making illegal expenditures, but nevertheless those expenditures would have had to have been reported through the Act. So that's just not true as a matter of the legal history. The voters voted for a clean election system that looked at both independent expenditures and candidate contributions as well as public financing. It's all part of the package. It's all part of the clean election system. The Commission had a rule on the books expanding and explaining that for years, and so that's just not true.
And so, Mr. Collins, what exactly do you want? As of right now, existing law requires any groups interested in influencing an election to form a committee, file expense reports, and disclose its donors. What do you want?
Well, I think this is actually a point on which I think that Eric and I probably largely agree. What we want is to have clear rules of the road. Right now, those groups have to do full reporting, right? So there are a subset of groups that has to do limited reporting that's called for directly and exclusively under the Clean Elections Act. But there's a broader set of groups, a different set of groups that may have to make more disclosures, including contributors, and the Act applies to them as well. And I think what Eric and I both agree on is that you ought to have clear rules of the road as to what the primary purpose of these groups is. And right now, one of the problems the Commission found when the Commission examined this back in the fall during the last election is that the notion of what the primary purpose of one of these dark money entities is kind of a black box. And the Commission is looking at how do we open that box up so spenders and voters know what the inputs are and how the analysis is going to work. Because when you have an open process like the Commission's, where people can come in and watch the Commission work, where people can understand the rules and see them written down, I think that's a better process moving forward, and make sure that people are going to know what's in, what's out, and what should be reported is reported.
All right, Mr. Collins. I want to give Mr. Spencer the final word here in this segment.
I appreciate my friend's remarks. Well, he believes that's a better process. It's not the one that's authorized under law. For the last 102 years, Secretary of State's office has handled this as the state's chief elections officer. We're the subject matter experts on at what point someone is subject to government regulation, becoming a PAC. The way it works is our office it. We refer it to the Attorney General's office. That process works fine. That's the way the Constitution and the statutes work. Clean Elections Commission doesn't have any business in that process. We hope that they voluntarily withdraw this ill-conceived rule that they've put out for comment.
All right, guys. Thanks for stopping by. And